who has seen the movie, a British movie, Love Actually? All right, great movie, yeah? The theme of the movie was, love is all around us. Well, energy is all around us as well. We consume an enormous amount of energy. Now, I'm going to ask you to stand up as well. Yeah. It's very short, I promise you. And together with me, we're going to do 2-3 knee bends like this. Okay? Right. Now, I'm doing this not to torture you. If we would do this, that means we are producers of energy. We would produce at a rate of 100 watts. Please have a seat. Now, what's the challenge? The challenge is that we're consuming energy at the rate of 2,000 watts on average. And of course, the big differences between emerging markets and developed. So we consume about 20 times more than we could humanly produce. Now, where's the rest coming from? Well, it's mainly coming from hydrocarbons. Now, my talk is about givens and wildcards in energy foresight. I know the team is 10 years, looking 10 years ahead. In energy foresight, 10 years is actually not much. We need to look a little bit further, but what we do in the next 10 years is going to be critical. So the next 10 years really matter. Let's start with defining what givens are all about. Well, a given, some people call it predetermined elements or megatrends. Well, there are two defining characteristics. One is it's quite predictable, and the second one is, well, it must have a big impact. If it doesn't have a big impact, we don't care. We wouldn't look at it as an important factor. And I identified 3 givens. Demographics, and there's much more than meets the eye when we talk about demographics, but more on that in a minute. Number 2 is hydrocarbon supply, and I'm specifically talking about a hydrocarbon supply because renewable energy technologies, even if they are commercially viable, the challenge is to deploy them rapidly. So we will be dependent, whether we like it or not, on hydrocarbons for a long time. Hopefully that mix changes quite dramatically in the future. And then thirdly, climate change. And climate change, some people are skeptics, but climate change is anthropogenic. You and me, we caused it. And that's something we have to accept. It also means we have to do something about it. So let's turn to demographics. We will add 800 million people to planet Earth over the next 10 years and 1.4 billion in the next 20 years. 1.4 billion, that's a new China or a new India. That's an enormous number of people. That's one key trend about demographics. The other trend is population is aging. And that's worldwide the case. On average, population is aging. But of course, there are enormous differences between, on the one hand, emerging markets and OECD countries, and even within emerging markets and OECD countries, there are also large variations. Let's look at OECD countries. The United States actually is doing quite well if we look at the population pyramid. It actually has a pretty healthy population pyramid today, but also going forward. And to a large extent, it's because of immigration policy and that people still see a future in the United States. Europe is a different story. In Europe, we have aging population, and that's going to be quite a big challenge for us. But the real interesting story comes with Japan. Japan is not only aging, but also the population is contracting. And that's something that we have never seen anywhere else without a war or without a pandemic. Typically, populations do not contract. But Japan has that challenge going forward. The story is also interesting when we look at emerging markets. And I picked 3 here. On the one hand, Latin America and Caribbean. And they're doing quite fine. Because if you look at the demographic profile, the number of working age people are actually growing by 2030 compared to today. So Latin America and the Caribbean, if they can take advantage of their demographic profile, they will be okay, at least from an economic point of view. China, with its one-child policy, 79, and still enforced today, although not necessarily enforced in cities, has a huge issue. On the one hand, its population is aging, and secondly, it has a gender imbalance. More male than female, and it's quite significant. Could have social and economic implications going forward. And actually, my guesstimate is it will. Some people have said that China may grow old before it grows rich. Right now, China is growing fast. Will it be able to continue to do that if its demographic profile is changing, but not in its benefit? And then India. India, large country, very young population, but every coin has two sides. India has a demographic bonus for as long as it can create 17 million jobs, incremental jobs, every single year. Otherwise, its unemployment rate would go up. In principle, India can do that. And actually, they have been doing it for the last 8 to 10 years. So why are we talking about demographics when we talk about energy foresight? Well, 1.4 billion people, where are we adding them? Well, we're adding them right at the bottom of the pyramid. And these people want to have a similar standard of living than you and me. They also want to climb the energy ladder. This chart actually shows on the horizontal axis energy demand, sorry, not energy demand, but GDP per capita, and on the vertical axis, energy demand. And it's not a linear relationship. It follows an S-curve. And whereas China is in the middle of the steep slope. And India is actually at that flexing point. So the two most populous countries in the world will make sure that there will be discontinuous growth in energy demand going forward. In the 90s, 1.6% per annum energy growth, demand growth. Since the 90s, about 1.8. The future will be more. So demographics is an important factor to take into account also in conjunction with economic growth and looking at energy demand. Let's turn to hydrocarbon supply. Some people say, well, there's a big issue. Well, there is an issue. There are various issues, actually, with hydrocarbon supply. But the question is it how much we have or how much we can actually economically produce? This chart shows how much we have, including what we have consumed already. It comes from the IEA. And there is actually no issue at all about the quantity. We consume 1.3 trillion barrels, and if you include the non-conventionals, like oil shales, gas to liquids, coal to liquids, then actually we have about 9 trillion barrels. The cost is going up, technology could bring that down, but we're not short of hydrocarbon supply, or resources, excuse me, not supply. The second thing then is, of course, well, how much can we economically produce? And so far, I've left out of the equation everything related to climate change. I will come to that in a minute. But how much can we economically produce? And it started, well, of course, you have the peak oilists that have, since the 1950s, actually 1956, when Hubert King came up with the peak theory for the United States, and actually he was right, 100% accurate. Since then, the peak oilists have not been very accurate. But it doesn't mean that they won't be accurate going forward. On the one hand, you have Shell as a company, and at the World Economic Forum annual meeting 2008, their CEO, Jeroen van der Veer, made a very interesting statement. He said, easy to access oil and gas supplies won't be able to meet demand anymore by 2015. Now, in energy time, 2015, that's tomorrow, eh? That's not long from us. That's tomorrow, right? 5 years is not a long time. Interestingly, the year after, the Marjorie, CEO of Total, made a very similar statement. He said, we will never be able to produce more than 89 million barrels per day. And today, we are roughly at about 80 million. So we can add about 10%, and then, same story. And he's saying, well, we could have another crisis by 2014, 2015. Same time frame as the Shell CEO. And then looking at Chevron, the vice chairman of the board, he said, well, the first trillion barrels, it took us 125 years. The next trillion is going to take us 35 years. There's definitely an accelerated consumption of hydrocarbons and all the consequences that it has. So the consensus view then among the peak oilers that sometime before 2020, supply won't be able to meet demand anymore. That's what they say. We may agree or disagree, but it's based on quite some solid research that lies behind it. And the problem is that there's nothing really, at least perceived by many, that could fill that vacuum, that wedge. Let's look at climate change. Who believes that climate change is created by you and me? Most of us, okay? Which is good. That's already, at least we're aware that we are the source of it. Yeah? There are cycles, natural cycles, but these natural cycles take about 100,000 years. And the variation is roughly 6 degrees Celsius between the peak and the value. What we're doing in a period of about 2 centuries is replicating that, but because of human activity. 2 centuries versus 100,000 years. And the IPCC in 2007 was very specific with a 90% confidence level. They said, we did it. We're guilty as charged, right? And that, in essence, creates a problem. These 3 givens actually are all related. And the next chart actually shows this. You can't really see this, but I wanted to show you that climate change is actually not, it's a complex system with also feedback loops. And on the one hand, the orange bubbles show human activity, consumption of fossil fuels, deforestation, urbanization, all of that contributes to climate change. And then the black area is basically the climate change process or the carbon cycle. And CO2 goes in, some is recycled, but also some stays and actually creates an effect, and that's reflected in the blue. And the blue says, well, ice is melting, etc. What's really of concern is, of course, the red, because the red are the impacts of climate change. I was at a conference not that long ago at IRI, the International Rice Research Center, and 1 degree Celsius increase in temperature reduces rice crops by 10 to 15% in the same location, in otherwise the same conditions. Well, we know that a lot of people rely on rice. Morning, breakfast, lunch, and for dinner. It's actually a very important source to feed people. I know I'm going to be a little bit controversial going forward. I've presented 3 givens. Most people will say, I can see this. And I will present now 2 somewhat controversial wildcards. First of all, what is a wildcard? Well, a wildcard has 3 defining characteristics. First of all, it must be a very, and I underline very low probability of occurring. Secondly, it must have a huge impact. Really, it's a punch in the face. That's what we're talking about. It's not something small. It's a shock to the system. That's what a wildcard is all about. And thirdly, after the fact, it can be explained and it's perceived as being logical. A recent wildcard is actually the BP platform in the Gulf. Why is it a wild card? Well, many platforms operating for decades, so it's a low probability event. No doubt about it. Huge impact, you bet. It's the biggest environmental disaster. But at the same time, we can explain it in a logical way after the fact because, well, it's a very hostile environment. That something goes wrong in an environment like this, with the casing and the cementing, it can happen. Whether there's human error in there or not, that's a different story. But it's a kind of a wild card. 2 wild cards in energy foresight. And there are more, but 2 wild cards that I want to present to you. One is meet the BRINKS. The BRINKS was coined last year by PFC Energy, and it's different than the BRICS. You all know about the BRICS. Goldman Sachs came up with it 2001, I believe. Brazil, Russia, India, China. These are large, so populous, fast-growing economies, and also Goldman Sachs clearly said that there's a drift in gravity, economic gravity, away from OECD countries towards the east. And we've seen that. And actually, these countries were quite resilient, even during the financial and economic crisis. But the BRINK is a different story. It's Brazil, Russia, Iraq, Nigeria, and Kazakhstan. These countries could bring oil supplies to market in large quantities in a very short period of time. The real wild card here is actually Iraq. The projects have been commissioned, the companies are in there, and they will bring the hydrocarbons to market because they need the currency. If we add this up, we have in excess of 4 million barrels per day in the next 5 years, and there's more to come thereafter. If that's the case, the oil peakists are wrong. Then there won't be a problem about supply meeting demand, at least not in the next 20 years. I consider this a negative wild card. Why a negative wild card? Because flooding of market of cheap oil will set us back on the renewable energy front big time. Because if oil prices are low, people do not invest in renewables. That's a big challenge. At the same time, the economic environment could be a roller coaster. Boom-bust cycles. So that's why I call it a negative wild card. Luckily, there's potentially also a positive one. Who likes nuclear energy? Look at me, not at the slide. Who likes nuclear energy? Okay, most of you don't. Okay. Well, 2 years ago, I didn't like nuclear energy. But I'm gradually changing my mind. I didn't like nuclear energy because two issues. One is that some of these plants can go supercritical. Look at Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island. Well, almost a disaster, the last one. But Chernobyl, big disaster. Latest estimates from a Russian research indicate that up to 2 million people will die directly or indirectly from the disaster. 2 million people. That's a pretty serious issue. But also, we create waste. And we don't have a solution for the waste. We just postpone it to the next generation. That's not a solution. Well, this could change. And that's why I consider this a positive wildcard. And I'm changing my mind about nuclear energy. But there's some conditions to it. This is an example from Hyperion Power. It's just one example. There are other companies, Toshiba, that has a similar technology. And it's very different. I come back to that in a minute. And then the real game changer is this technology, is TerraPower. And this is a traveling wave reactor. The first technology is functional. Some are being installed. This one will become functional in the next 10 to 15 years. Why is it a game changer? It's a game changer because it fundamentally changes the view of nuclear energy. Small, scalable, modular, cannot go supercritical, and it solves a problem. It consumes spent fuel as its fuel. So it doesn't create a problem. It solves a problem. And in addition, it's a stationary battery. You can put it here in order to power the Madrid hub. And it will be safe. There's no concern for you. Now, energy foresight. Why do we talk about energy foresight? Because it concerns us all. We said it in the beginning, love is all around us, but energy is all around us as well. But we need to challenge our own mental models going forward, because solutions will not come from policymakers or businesses acting alone. It will come from a variety of actors. And when there's uncertainty, there's of course the Chinese philosophy that uncertainty is both risk and opportunity. But we can only grab the opportunity if we really understand the underlying uncertain factors. Thank you.